Hello there, this is the Brussels Signal Studio. My name is Justin Stairs and you're watching the fourth and final part of our elections coverage special. We're here today to talk about the EU and the rest of the world. There are a number of subjects we're going to be looking at. For example, the growing rivalry between the US and China. Where does the European Union and the rest of Europe fit in? Secondly, what about Europe's values? Will Europe be strong enough to impose its values on the rest of the world, or should it, in fact, stop lecturing? And thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, are we headed for World War III? If we are, should Europe be moving towards a war economy? That's what some people say. Difficult issues. We've got a number of guests for you. Let's get started.
The European Union today is under more external pressure than ever before. With its share of the global economy in decline, Brussels now finds itself with a war on its border it has been unprepared to handle. Attempts at European remilitarisation have so far yielded little, with polls showing that few young people in the Bloc's West are willing to fight on behalf of their nations. Things only look set to get harder. While the United States has been a key ally in helping prop up Europe's fading military might, growing instability in the Pacific and Middle East has left the premier superpower looking increasingly spread thin. The possible re-election of President Donald Trump in November is likely only to accelerate this trend, as isolationism grows in popularity amongst American voters. Meanwhile, the influence of Russia and China grows. The collapse of Francafrique in particular has left a power vacuum in the Third World, one that powers hostile to Europe and the United States are quickly occupying. What impact, if any, will the new European Parliament have on these issues? Will it be able to push back the tide of crises plaguing the continent?
Right, we're back in the Brussels Signal studio. I'm here with Deconinck, who's a reporter on Brussels Signal, and we're here to talk about the EU and the world, and in particular, a war economy. What does that mean? Should Europe move towards a war economy, as some politicians and lobbyists are saying here in Brussels? We're going to talk about that, but before we do, let's hear from a couple of experts. I'd like to put on a quick video interview I did with Philip Pilkington, who is the host of the Multipolarity podcast. He's based in Ireland, and he had a few things to say on the subject. In particular, he emphasized the role of energy. Let's have a look at that video.
I think whether democratic system or not, I mean, we've had war economies under democracies before in Second World War. I think the real question is energy, 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 right? We're talking about the fact that we can't even produce chemicals at a reasonable cost anymore, and that our chemical factories in Germany, for example, are shutting down. I don't know how exactly you run a war economy on extremely expensive energy. I suppose you could shut down all trade, like I suppose Nazi Germany did in the Second World War, and substitute in very strange energy forms. For example, the National Socialists in Germany actually extracted a form of diesel or petroleum from coal during the war because they were lacking in oil. But doing such cost-ineffective techniques is extremely taxing on your economy and would have to come at the expense of vastly lower living standards. I mean, if you wanted to try and run a war economy in Europe right now, it really would be every gallon of petrol or gas, as the Americans say, that was being put into the tank of a tank will be coming out of the tank of your car. I mean, there really isn't much excess to go around. Russia have the advantage, the innate advantage, of being a large net energy producer, the largest in the world, actually, and the second largest in the world relative to population after Saudi Arabia. So, I mean, the first thing I'd say to the European policymakers who are suggesting that we do this is where exactly are we going to get the energy? And if we are going to go onto some sort of a total war footing, how much consumption are we willing to see lost for the average consumer? Because it seems to me you'd probably be looking at, I don't know, I mean, 40% or something. I mean, you know, petroleum shortages, rationing, drive your car twice a day. I mean, that's what you'd be talking about.
Okay, so that was Philip. Hold on one second while we run the second video, which is from Antonio Alonso, who is a professor at the San Pablo University in Madrid. And he, Carl, emphasized the difference between a command economy and a market economy and what that meant for war. Let's listen to him.
we don't produce according to the demands from the state, but according to demands of the market. This is generally speaking, in any business, in any factory here in Europe, is like this. You are producing according to the demands of the market. What is the demand in the sector, in the security sector, in the defense sector, the war? Russia, which is only one country, they have transformed their economy into a war economy, into an economy of war. So almost everything in Russia is produced to get the main goals, the main objectives of Vladimir Putin to win the war. And here in Europe is something very, very different. 2 years later, 2 years after the beginning, the military special operation, the Ukrainian invasion and so on, we didn't agree among ourselves what is our political objective apart from winning the war against Russia, and we didn't really convince ourselves on the necessity to invest greatly in such field. Keep in mind also that for 1 year, for the first year of war, the United States invested more than in 20 years in Afghanistan.
So, Carl, what do you think to what you just heard?
I thought it was very interesting what Mr. Pilkington said. He talked about the need for cheap energy and how impossible that was, but I think actually we do have that, and that is nuclear energy.
Right, but that's very divisive still in Europe, isn't it? I mean, some countries such as France, for example, are going for it big time, whereas other countries are still wondering if they should do it, or in fact have decided not to do it at all, like in Belgium, right? Where are we in Belgium?
Belgium is a very interesting case because we are the biggest opponents and the biggest champion of nuclear energy.
At the same time, that's very Belgian,
isn't it?
It's very typical
because we have the Green Party, where we have Tinne van der Straten, who is Minister of Energy, and she does not like nuclear at all. She's a Green politician. But then we have Alexander De Croo, who didn't like nuclear energy, but now he's a champion of nuclear energy. I think a couple of months ago, he organized a big summit. It was one of the first ever where they announced European countries joining the nuclear alliance or something in that regard.
There's a group of countries that now within the EU who are pro-nuclear, but there are other countries that are anti-nuclear. I'm just wondering, like Germany, for example, at least until now, anyway, I mean, is this a solution? Because it's surely the scale is too small, at least at the moment.
It's a matter of timing. If we think purely economically speaking, I think we can create nuclear power plants all we need, but in a hostile situation with an adversary as Russia, I think that's a problem.
Right, because it would take too long to build the nuclear plants. Okay, so going back to Philip's point then,
we have a problem.
We certainly do have a problem. That's if we go to war, we have a problem, because without the energy, we're going to basically have to give up driving around in our cars in order to send all the fuel to the tanks at the front. That doesn't sound much fun, does it? That's in addition to the bombardments and the deaths, of course. But, right. I mean, and what about this idea that Russia is obviously a command economy of sorts now, whereas we're still a market economy of sorts, and therefore we would have to give up that as well, I guess.
That's a matter of political leadership, I would say. And Russia has a very strong political leader that everyone here objects to, Vladimir Putin. But the question is, who is or will be our leader? And who were our leaders? And how did they do? And what do we want to achieve? I think Europe needs a big narrative shift, rather from peace and working together and harmony and all those kind of buzzwords. And now it's about the real stuff. And it's what do we want to achieve? At what price? At what cost? Who will decide? How will we take into account who decided and if that was a good decision or not. So now we really need to have a real conversation about stuff.
Were you hinting that Europe needs stronger leadership? Is that what you mean?
If you want to go to war, we do.
Right. I mean, and if there is a European leader, who could it be? Is there anyone that comes to mind? Emmanuel Macron, is he the guy to lead Europe into war, if there is one, heaven forbid?
That's a good question. I don't know. I don't think he's super popular for the moment. So maybe I would suggest someone else. But the question is, who can lead the European continent? Because we always talk about unity and diversity. Okay, we have our diversity. Where's the unity? Where's the strength? I'm not seeing it right now.
Yeah, I think that's a fairly good point. And when you look at the European Union institutions, I mean, the leaders of these institutions haven't really been men and women of the people who can lead armies into battle. They're more technocratic figures.
That's the age-old thing that was thrown against their feet. They are the bureaucratic, technocratic elites.
Right.
That's not the inspiring person you want to walk behind towards the battlefield.
I think that's fair. That's the war economy, of course, and connected to that, we have sanctions. Sanctions which arguably haven't worked or haven't worked as well as they were designed to work. Before we talk for 2 minutes on that subject, I wanted to introduce another video, and that is by Attila Demkó, who is from the MCC think tank. He is head of the Center for Geopolitics. Let's hear what he had to say on sanctions.
We have to talk not only about natural gas but also oil. So Russia is a cheaper source of natural gas and oil than any other source, and because of the pipeline system. And pipeline is as a method of transfer is cheaper and easier than let's say LNG ships, which are coming from the US or Qatar. So definitely there is truth in that, and definitely we have to think that in some cases sanctions are doing more harm to Europe than to Russia. For example, in the case of oil, Russia could reroute oil exports to India. I just been to India in April, and they told me in no uncertain terms that they will continue to buy Russian oil. Actually, they refine it and they sell it on a high price to Europe. So actually, these sanctions have a limited effectiveness when we talk about oil and gas. In my view, I'm not an economist, but if we are poorer in Europe because of such sanctions, we can help Ukraine less. So we have to rethink in every case. I think most sanctions are effective and good, but energy sanctions, when you talk about a country like Russia, with one of the largest energy production in the world, I don't think that this can defeat Russia or even slow Russia down. Somebody else will buy, especially the oil. It's easier to reroute than gas. Somebody else will buy it, and we will just pay more at the end of the day. And by the way, through Ukraine, Hungary is still getting the oil from Russia. But Hungary is paying a very large sum of money to Ukraine for the transfer. So actually, even Ukraine profits from this. And if it wouldn't happen, Hungary would pay much more for the oil through the Croatian pipeline system. Ukraine would lose the transfer fee. And it would be a lose-lose situation, since Hungary is returning some of the oil to Ukraine after processing as diesel oil. So Hungary is exporting about 10 to 15% of Ukrainian consumption. And, diesel oil can be used for cars, but can be used for tanks. So this situation is again a win-win situation for Ukraine and Hungary. And in a way, yes, for Russia. But otherwise, we are in a lose-lose-lose situation, and Russia is losing the least from the sides.
So, sanctions. Am I right in saying they've had almost no effect at all? I mean, maybe that's going over the top a bit, but it seems to me as if when I look at the oil price, for example, the European Commission and the G7 nations tried to cap the amount of money that was going to go to Russia. That clearly hasn't worked. Do sanctions ever work?
That I was about to ask that, because as I remember, that's always a debate about Cuba. Everyone on the left, particularly, or Europe, I think, as a whole, opposes sanctions against Cuba because they don't work. They only hurt the normal people. In Iran, it's the same thing. And now suddenly it's changed for Russia. That seems like a very weird angle. And we see an effect. It's us being sanctioned, losing our cheap gas, cheap oil access. And the Russians, I don't see them being hurt so much, actually.
Well, not as much, maybe, but they're still selling oil to India. I mean, as we've just heard in the video, and the Indians are refining it and selling it back to us. That seems somehow perverse. I mean, I know that some people have looked at the total revenues for Russia and said, oh, look, it's gone down, it's gone up. I mean, it depends on the value of the dollar and other currencies as well, doesn't it? But sanctions, I mean, there have been, how many rounds of sanctions have there been? More
14,
than, yeah,
14,
we're up to number 14. I mean, is it time for a new approach? And is that even possible? Because they can't exactly wind them down now.
I do think there is an economic baseline. If you have tens of thousands of hundreds of thousands of young men of your nation fighting and dying rather than working, that's a negative. If you don't sell to one of the biggest markets in the world, i.e. Europe, that's a negative. So in the end, Russia is bleeding. But in a war, it's always like our Hungarian professor told us.
Yes.
It's both parties are losing, and it's a matter of fact on who can take the most losses and who is willing to bleed for it the most. And then the question is, how much does Europe want to bleed?
Right, so it's a long-term game, basically. Okay.
Only losers.
Right. Okay. Now, over the long term, let's hope it's long-term. Let's hope it never happens. But long-term, short-term, who knows when we could be going from talk of a war economy, talk of sanctions, into talk of actual war. Obviously now with China reportedly supporting Russia financially, militarily, North Korea, Iran. I mean, Russia has support from several other countries. So from that perspective, impossible to say for sure, but what's your gut feeling, Carl? Is this World War III or not?
Depends on how you define it. In a global scale, it is obvious that there are global blocs competing against each other, and actually we're quite isolated. The West is versus China, Russia. India is not an ally of us. They're selling our oil to us from Russia, as was told before, and they're not our friends, they're not our enemies, but China is a little bit more hostile because they want to have a more leading position. Russia is very hostile for the moment, but they also fear the Chinese. So what is a world war? Who fights who? I don't know. So in a global scale of things, it doesn't look friendly, at least.
Let's hear what our guests had to say on this very subject. I asked them whether they thought World War III had already started. Let's hear what they said.
I don't know if the Third World War has started, but maybe yes, very probably yes. But for sure, absolutely for sure, the war in 2 months, the war in 1 year will be very, very different to 2-3 years ago, or 4 years ago, or 5 years ago. The war of globalization has passed away, and we are going to have more problems to trade our goods and services with other parts of the world.
We don't really know when a world war starts. Actually, I don't think everybody knew in June 1914 that the world war started when Austria-Hungary attacked Serbia. So we don't really know where we are in a given moment in history. But let's hope that we are not going to that direction. I think everybody knows that World War III would mean the annihilation of if not mankind, but the Northern Hemisphere for sure. Since we are in the atomic age, both sides have roughly equivalent nuclear atomic strike power. And Russia is actually stronger in terms of tactical nuclear weapons and delivery systems for such weapons. So I would say that we will avoid World War III, but we are definitely in an almost hot Cold War with Russia. And this is something which we would need to stop the sooner the better, since I don't really see any outcome which is a conventional victory over Russia in Ukraine, even with the more help from the United States and Europe. And of course, I don't really see any outcome that Russia can fully defeat Ukraine. So it's basically a war which is a stalemate with a slow Russian surging ahead on the east, but it's definitely not something which Russia hoped for. It's definitely not what was hoped for after the first defeats of Russia in 2022. So I think it's a very painful war for all sides. In a war which everybody is losing. Ukraine is losing the most. I just came back from Ukraine. I just visited Ukraine twice in the last 3 weeks. So Ukraine is losing lives, people, economic power every day. Europe is not winning with this war, and of course Russia is not winning this war. So it's a lose-lose-lose war. If somebody wins, actually, it's maybe China and other powers, but definitely not the Western world and not Russia and not Ukraine. So we have to find a solution. Again, I don't believe that we are in World War III, but still this is a dangerous situation. Escalations can happen, and actually we always forget that those who are leading the great powers, Russia, United States, or China, they are also humans like us. So they make mistakes, and in such a situation when there is so little trust left between the sides, it would be wise to stop this war as soon as possible. Even if I know very well that Russia is in no mood to stop. But still, we have to find. We should really go into that direction for the sake of Ukraine, actually, and for the sake of the Northern Hemisphere.
So we heard then both sides, in fact, of this argument. One person said, no, this isn't World War III. The other one said, yes. Now, obviously, the question comes up, if this is World War III, where are we going to get the soldiers from? Now, there have been the idea of reintroducing some kind of military service has been floated around in several countries. In the UK, it's been on the official programme manifesto of the government. What do you think, Carl? I mean, Carl, for the benefit of our viewers, is both Flemish and Belgian, probably in that order. Would you fight for Belgium? And if not, would you fight for Flanders, Carl?
I will give my special service to the nation, and I am willing to write fake news against the enemy.
Ah, okay. So you'd rather not get in the trenches in the front line?
That's a bit dangerous for me.
Okay. And when you say to your country, which country is that?
Personally, I would go for Flanders.
Okay. Well, obviously, this is a big issue because there's a big question mark as to whether people today would be prepared to fight for their countries. What do you think? I mean, could you call up an army like they used to?
I think you can in the hour of need, but there's nothing that gives the impression to the people that we are in the time of need, because we're not even in a war economy. Like we just said, we still have a market economy. We have some expensive prices. Okay, that's annoying, but that's not war. I think when people start to feel it and start to fear it, people will rally around the flag. The question is, what flag? Belgium, Flanders, Europe?
Right, the European flag, maybe they'll be taking that into the trenches, do you think? I can't quite see it myself. Anyway, that's great. Carl Deconinck, thank you very much.
Anytime.
For your comments, for your expert comment. We're going to hear now from Antonio López-Istúriz, who has been an MEP from Spain's People's Party, the Partido Popular. He has been chairman of the delegation for relations with Israel and has sat on the Committee for Foreign Affairs. Thank you for finding some time, Mr. López-Istúriz. I'm going to look forward, please, because obviously after the elections, one of the first things that the European Parliament will have to do is decide on a new president or the same president for the European Commission. Now, as I understand it, the People's Party in Spain have been loyal allies of the president. Is that true, and why?
Well, because in the Spanish Partido Popular, we have been always very loyal and disciplined members of the European People's Party. And Ursula von der Leyen is the EPP's candidate. Although, unfortunately, the Spitzencandidate was dissolved after the 2019 elections, she is our candidate, and I hope that the Council will see like this after the European elections, and that she will be re-elected as president of the European Commission. We don't have now time for new, let's say, adventures. We need an experienced president that has exercised Europe's image. She has been the image, the representative of our European Union all around the world. She has been, I think, a fair president of the Commission. No one can say that she has used, let's say, classical EPP programs for her tenure, like the Green Deal, like many social agreements that she has put through. And but nevertheless, she has maintained a strong unity and work of our member states through very difficult times, like COVID times, like the war on Ukraine, and so many other crises that we are facing.
Right. In fact, one of the other crises, of course, is Gaza, and she has been vocal in her support for Israel. I ask you this because you're obviously you're the Israel expert. This has been a very divisive issue among the European Union member states. In fact, in your country, Spain, it's been a particularly sensitive issue. I mean, so you support von der Leyen despite the fact that she supports Israel, and your country in Spain is more of a supporter of Palestine. Is that a fair summary?
I would not like to speak that I am the spokesperson for the Spanish people, like the left does. I would not be so, let's say, ambitious. I think, like everybody all around Europe, this is a divisive, unfortunately, item and situation that is also part of the politics polarization. I think that Ursula von der Leyen has been fair, first in denouncing the attack of Hamas on Israel, which started this war, something that I miss from the left commissioners, high representative, and others from the left. I missed that very much during the initial stages of this attack. And she has been fair also in her critics, also to Israel in the management of some stages of these Gaza operations. Europe needs Israel. Israel needs Europe. The Europeans, we have been talking for a long time about the two-state solution. I think that now the world stage is being set for this after the conflict, and the recognition of the Palestinian territories as a state by the government of Spain only an electoral game, only for electoral purposes. It's a big mistake, and it's not what the Spanish people think. I think it is not good to mix elections with these kind of decisions. It has to be done by the European diplomacy.
Okay. Now let's look a bit further forward then. Obviously, the next big election, or one of the next big elections, is in the US. Now, are you a fan of former President Trump, and what will it mean if he is re-elected?
No, I'm not a fan, but I am very respectful with American voters. Actually, my mother is American. I still believe that, like Israel, the United States is a democracy. Like European countries, whatever the choice they make democratically, I have to respect. And this is, again, something that the left and the media that supports the left does not understand. Further from that, what we have to do, if Trump is elected, is to work like we did last time in order to bring him into an understanding of the essential relationship between the European Union and the United States. I know it's difficult, but I'm not part of the polarization. I am not part of the show mania that the left is showing about this. What I think we have to do is to work seriously to keep the transatlantic relation working. Whoever is president of the United States, democratically elected.
Okay, now you mentioned democracy there, and you said you do believe that the US is a democracy. I'm just wondering, in your work in the European Parliament, you've obviously dealt with democracies and dictatorships. Should Europe treat all countries the same, or is there a fundamental difference? Should there be a fundamental difference in the way we treat democracies? I ask this question because the European Commission and others have had the tendency, at least in the past, to lecture other countries. This is the way we do it. This is the way you should do it. This is the way you should treat women, or this is the policy that you should adopt on the death penalty, etc., etc. In your work, is there a fundamental distinction or not?
Again, we should be respectful of democracies. And if we have discrepancies, we can mention, but it is not up to us to decide. It's to the people of the countries to decide. Second, no more concessions to dictatorships. Fortunately, Borrell will not continue as High Representative of the European Union after the renewal of the Commission, and we all hope that there will be someone that will not have an ideological approach to the external relations of the European Union. No longer can we be soft on Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and dictatorships, that they only understand approaches and soft positions on them as weaknesses of the European Union. We have to be very tough.
Right. Okay. Now you mentioned being tough on these dictatorships. What about Spain's immediate neighbours in North Africa? I mean, that's a difficult one. Within the European Parliament, has had some very tough words to say. For example, about Morocco. Should the EU be very tough with Morocco and Libya and Tunisia, the North Africa? Is that same apply?
Well, you are talking of about very, very different countries from the political perspective. Let's remind that. Morocco has democratic elections. They have a democratically elected prime minister and government.
But they have been accused of meddling in the democratic process. For example, their treatment of journalists.
That's another thing. That's another thing that, if proved, should be require our reaction and response. But while it's not proved by our and theirs democratic judges and institutions, then we have to wait. I rely on the judicial system, on our security system in Europe to demonstrate if this is true. And then, again, action should be taken. But until that moment, again, I'm not so ambitious as the media in Europe and others in order to say if they're guilty or not. It is up to the judges to decide so. And I have been always very respectful of this. I'm not going to substitute judges. I believe in division of powers. And this is something, by the way, that the left in Europe has forgotten. I do not forget.
Right.
Tunisia is a different case. There is not a democratically now elected government. We all know that. Or in Egypt, of course, this is very different. And the attitude should be corresponding to the lack of level of democracy that these countries are showing.
Okay. And you mentioned Josep Borrell, who is, of course, the EU foreign minister. What is your assessment of his work over the last over the last few years? Because obviously the Commission has been tasked with becoming more political. That was one of the roles that the Commission President took on. Assess his work, please.
I think that he has tried, but finally his ideological background beat him. And also his naivete and soft approach to some dictatorships is not good. Two examples. Venezuela. He tried to approach the government of Maduro. For the elections, everything was ready for an electoral mission headed by the European Union to control the elections. What happens? After many concessions from the European Commission, we are not welcome in the electoral process in Venezuela. I think that unfortunately, Josep Borrell may be well-intentioned, but he failed. Again, he showed weaknesses that unfortunately, these regimes tend to see as weaknesses when you offer this kind of helping hand.
Right. Okay, that's great. Mr. López-Istúriz, thank you. That we're going to leave it there. Many thanks for your time and for your very clear statements that you think the Cold War has come back and you know what side you're on. Thank you very much for that. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.